Hey guys, what's up? What are the genres of fantasy? And there's lots of different subgenres of fantasy. Fantasy as a whole is, I would say, it's even hard to really define, but I would say a, um, it is something where it's like it's on another world, but it's not in the future. Like it's not technological. So if it's technological, it's that's not fantasy, right? That's sci-fi. But if there's fantasy, even if there's sci-fi, even if there's some technology, but there's also fantasy, like there's magic and there's swords and there's knights and wizards, then it's like a sci-fantasy or a fantasy that also has sci-fi elements. Um, and so like a lot of writers or people that create fantasy stories would incorporate science fiction in their stories because they're fantasy stories, but in the future. But that's just one kind of fantasy, the science fantasy, where it's science fiction, but it's also fantasy. It's not just like, you're not just going to be watching like a science fiction, people on a spaceship, just trekking along the universe or exploring the universe or whatever it is, um, without any kind of mysticism, magic, swords, like knights, wizards, monsters, all kinds of like creatures, like elves or uh, um, creatures that are not human, but they're like sentient. They're like human, but they're not like human. Like elves. Elves are very human, but they're not people human. They're like people, but they're not human. They're elves, right? Elves, dwarves, all of these other races of people um, that are not human. Like for example, maybe instead of like evolving from apes, these characters evolved from dragons, so they're not really human, but they're human-like, and they have human-like characters. So there's also magic items like rings, swords, weapons, gauntlets, whatever it is, that some magic item could also make a fantasy. So I would say, like, even if it's got science fiction things in it, like technology, spaceships, time machines, any kind of sci-fi, laser beams, laser guns, swords made out of light, or swords made out of laser or whatever it is. It's fantasy, but it's science fantasy. And it's not science fiction because science fiction is just the sci-fi, just the technology without the magic, without the like adventure and magic items and mysticism and wizards and things like that, knights and whatever, or beasts like dragons. If you have dragons and you have a sci-fi, you have a fantasy, because like dragons are like the quintessential fantasy symbol. So there's science fantasy. That's like the first kind of fantasy. And then there's like sort of like medieval fantasy. And medieval fantasy, I think that's the most common fantasy that people think of fantasy when they think of fantasy, like medieval fantasy. And medieval fantasy would be like taking place during medieval times. So there are kings and queens and castles, there are knights on horses, there are all kinds of dungeons where there's monsters that live there. There's lands where there's like, if you need to travel, you travel by horse, you travel by ship, like there's no technology. There's basically, it's all, there's no technology. It's basically all the amount of technology they had in the Middle Ages, which is no light bulbs. There's like candles and there's torches, for light. And and there's no high tech anything. The food is very, very low tech. Everything is low tech. It's like the technology of the Middle Ages up to the Renaissance. And I think after Renaissance, you could still have like medieval fantasy and Renaissance, but I don't think that's actually medieval fantasy anymore. That's Renaissance fantasy. And I guess Renaissance fantasy is the kind of fantasy you would get in a Renaissance fair, where this is more of a swordsmanship kind of like thing. It's like a little bit more high tech than medieval fantasy, and it's more about. It's not as much medieval, with dragons and everything. It's like sort of like a little bit higher tech. It's like higher tech. It's just like the things that were happening in medieval fantasy is not the same thing as Renaissance fantasy. Renaissance, there was like a different way of talking, a different way of dressing. It's still medieval fantasy, but it was just the style is different. It's a little bit more into the future, but not really that far away. Like if you saw medieval fantasy and it had some Renaissance looking people with Renaissance looking costumes and stuff like that, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference too much. But you wouldn't have like medieval fantasy, you would have like Vikings, Celts or Celts or however you pronounce it, I don't even know. And all of the different, maybe like barbarians. And what's interesting about medieval fantasy, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the medieval time. It can happen way before the medieval time. Like Conan the Barbarian takes place, I guess like years before medieval. I mean, it's just like, I've not read Conan the Barbarian because Conan I think is more of a visual story, like it's more of a comic book story than it is a novel story, but there are a lot of people who love the novels and they're big fans of the Conan novels and stuff, but I haven't read them. But I did read the comic books, and it's basically, that's medieval fantasy, you know, but I think the actual Conan goes way back, like pre-medieval. So if you've got Vikings, warriors, quests, ships, all that kind of thing is medieval fantasy. Renaissance fantasy, I think the ships are more advanced, and there's not really a lot different. It's just the way that people were dressed and the way things looked a little bit, and people were a little bit more like educated. They can read and write more than like in medieval fantasy where there were scribes to read and write, and people really didn't do it. And with Renaissance, they read, they wrote, they painted. There was more arts. It's like the difference between when you see the medieval art in the museum, it's a little bit like lower tech, lower quality, sort of like the art wasn't as advanced as when you're looking at the Renaissance art, which is like amazing, beautiful paintings and stuff like that. So that's the difference for that. And then there's like, I guess you can go all the way back pre-medieval, and I think that's where like Conan the Barbarian goes. Like it's pre-medieval. It's before, it's like there's medieval things, but this is really before, like Conan, I think it's before knights and that kind of medieval kind of like thing, you know. It's like instead of like the 15th century, Conan is like 500 AD or something like that, you know, 600 AD, where there's swords, there's technology like that, there's steel. It's like the Steel Age, you know, like it was after the Iron Age into the Steel Age. And that's where you get the Conan stories, where like this is like pre-knights, you just get barbarians, where barbarians kind of like lived, you know, on the land and stuff like that. So there's that. And then when you go like more into the modern day, you can see more of an urban fantasy, and that's really, really, really cool. If you've ever read, what is it called? John Constantine's Hellblazer. Hellblazer is urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is cool because it happens during the present day, but it's fantasy. It's like, it's still like John Constantine's a magician, and he's a wizard, and he's an occultist, and basically summoning demons, summoning spirits, casting spells, and other people and beings that's otherworldly, and it's very, very like, very, very magic, like occult, voodoo, like oriented, where there's a lot of magic happening, and their people are like wizards and magicians, but they're not wizards that lived like all the way back in the medieval day. They're wizards that live in the modern day. And what's cool is like, it's basically the modern day. There's cars, there's lights, there's stores, and there's all kinds of everything, the technology of modern day. But there's that crossover into occultists, wizards, magicians, people that know how to cast spells. People can like shoot lightning bolts from their fingers and things like that. And it works really, really well because in modern day, you don't really think a lot of magic like you thought back then. Like in the medieval ages and back in the day, there were lots of like tales of wizards who just walk the land, and magicians and people who were sages and were very, very knowledgeable and could cast spells, and they were like mysterious and everything like that. And maybe there was also like knights and people with swords and things like that. And you don't really think that kind of carried over, because in modern day fantasy or modern day stories, you don't get a lot of magicians, walking around in the land, like in the world, with modern day fiction. But when you go to urban fantasy fiction, now it's like you're mixing magic with modern day. And what's interesting about the way they mix magic with modern day is they don't really have it's not the same thing. A wizard like back in medieval fantasy or older fantasy would look like a wizard, talk like a wizard, like the wizard from the Lord of the Rings, like he would, or Gandalf, or Merlin, long gray hair, a cloak or a coat or something like that with a hood, a staff and a dagger, and a spell book, a crystal ball, a wand, to shoot lightning from this wand and stuff like that. And he would raise his staff and say these magic words, and a bolt of energy would shoot from the staff and hit the dragon that's trying to eat him or kill him or whatever. And so that is the classic magician, the classic wizard. But in modern day urban fantasy, it's more of a cult, because when you think of modern fantasy, when you think of modern magic, you think occult. It's more of the occultists in the modern day, the ones that really are knowledgeable about magic and cast spells and things like that. So when you have characters who are occultists, it blends really, really well with the modern day, because they don't walk around in a cloak. They don't walk around with a staff, unless you're the Dresden Files, the guy, Harry Dresden actually does walk around with a staff. But whatever. That's cool, because he's also an occultist. That's just another version. The Dresden Files is another series of stories about, it's basically urban fantasy where he's an occultist, but the adventure he goes on is in modern day. So he's sort of trying to look for the bad guy that's doing some kind of mischief in his world. I haven't read a lot of Dresden. I read a little Dresden. I do think Dresden works better visually, a lot better visually, because it's very, very hard to read. It's just they're always describing these action scenes, the guy who writes the Dresden Files. And those action scenes, instead of just describing them, it would just look so much cooler if they just painted them or drew them or got an artist to draw it. And that would just look so much better than just trying to imagine what's actually happening in the book. But that's modern, that's urban fantasy. And I would say the best urban fantasy is John Constantine's Hellblazer. Constantine, that guy is fantasy, because what happens is it's just people living in the modern world. And then when he comes around, things just go haywire, things just go all out. There's demons following him. There's other kinds of occultists following him that he knows. He gets into all kinds of trouble. He casts these powerful spells. There's ghosts, there's spirits, there's all kinds of beings and different monsters in the books and everything. And that it makes a really good comic book, way, way better comic book. They did write a little Constantine novels and stuff like that. And I read one of the Constantine novels, and why I kind of enjoyed it, I did feel it's better as a comic book, because it's better, it's very visual, and you actually want to see the things drawn on a page rather than try to imagine it. And I just feel it works so much better as a comic book than it works as a novel. And I think urban fantasy works a lot better as a comic book than a novel. So there's that. And there's and then there's I wouldn't say sci-fi is not fantasy. I think sci-fi kind of is fantasy, but it's fantasy about the future. And the thing about fantasy and why it's so compelling is because the world we live in now is not fantasy. It probably won't be. The world, it's not that it's like not fantasy, it's just like fantasy happens in the natural world, you know, where people ride horses, there's no technology, they're like making their own clothes or buying clothes from someone who makes clothing and stuff like that. It's old technology. It's the technology of the Middle Ages, and the stories of magic and witchcraft, and stories of high adventure, you know. And we, as like, our civilization has went beyond that and probably cannot go back. I mean, the only thing that that will put us back into the Middle Ages or into the Dark Ages is if we somehow all of our technology fails, you know. And I don't think it's gonna fail. Like, even if we run out of oil or coal or something like that, it's still not gonna fail. We're gonna find other ways to build stuff. But the thing is that it just tells us like of a time long past that we probably cannot relive. You know, living back in the day, whether you believe in magic or not, whether you believe that dragons were real or not, or unicorns or Pegasuses or Pegasi, or like you know, elves, or any of the things that were told, because these were stories of old. I mean, they were stories saying that King Arthur was a real person, Merlin was a real person. These were real people, and who knows what happened back then, you know. But the thing is that because we have technology kind of like takes us away from that, and we can never relive that world. So we always trying to like go back to that. We're trying to like, you know, an escape from the regular world, the real world. We would go into science fiction, or we'd go into fantasy. Science fiction is like the future, because we don't live in the future, we live in our present technology. But the question is like, what would things be like if technology was just like off the cuff, was completely like, you know, completely like way more advanced than it is now? Or if technology like didn't exist, and we had to like rely on old tech and old ways of doing things, and the creatures and the spirits and the people that lived back then, whether they were fairies or whatever. If you look at old Irish myths, Scottish myths, English myths, they talked about fairies that lived on that land. And the Celts also talked about druids, who were these like people that walked around the forests, and they were basically magicians and wizards and stuff like that. So it's just like we either don't live in that far future where we're on other planets, traveling across the galaxy, and meeting other life forms that live not too far away from us, who are also like intelligent or sentient, or able to like relate with us in some way, or all the way in the back, you know, all the way in the past, where things that just were completely different than they are now. And so like we live in this present day. So I feel like so we can never go to any of those places. But with urban fantasy, I feel like that's something people can relate with a little bit more in our present day, because urban fantasy is just that one step beyond story. It's like things just are going on and they're happening, and then it's like one step beyond. You know, they draw the circle, they cast the, you know, they draw the magic symbols, they say the spell, they say the words, you know, they light the candles, they burn the smoke, and spirits are just like coming into the, you know, just spirits are like, you know, like coming into the room and stuff like that, and they're casting these spells and stuff like that. And that's just like amazing, because we always like think about, you know, what if we like, how do we like connect with that kind of thing? How do we connect with magic? How do we connect with you know, spirits and the world of the unknown, the world of magic, the world of fantasy, basically? And that's the word, is like, it's fantasy no matter like if it's in the present day and you're connecting with a fantasy elements, which you would call fantasy, like ghosts, whether you believe ghosts exist or not, it's still a fantasy story. And you connect with fantasy elements in the present world, or you're talking about another world where you create another world where it's a, you know, you create like a whole another world or another like universe or a multiverse, or a world where like there are like different people living and there's different societal structures, and maybe there's emperors and chaos beings and whatever, right? And or like it's something way in the past that you can never reach. And that's why, like, I think time machine stories are cool, because they allow you to go into the future, the past, other like civilizations. They allow you to pretty much go everywhere. The time machine is like the link of every kind of fantasy story that you can possibly write into one, because it explains how you can go from world to world, future to past, and, you know, go into the past and meet Merlin, and go into the future and meet aliens who live like in another part of our galaxy or in another galaxy, you know? And so I think those are the main categories of fantasy. But I'm gonna say that like fantasy, it doesn't matter if it happens in like in the present, whether fantasy happens in the future, in the past, on another plane of existence, on another galaxy, in another part of our galaxy, in another universe, completely in another universe. It doesn't matter where it is. It's created by imagination, and it's a world that's structured and created by imagination, and someone's imagination that created a whole world and a whole story with characters, plots, settings, and, you know, like all kinds of like feelings that they put into those stories. And it gives you the chance to actually travel through reading someone's story, or listening to someone's story, or even looking at someone's story if they draw it. It lets you go into someone's imagination, into someone's vision, into someone else's world that they created, or maybe it's a world that's already inside them. And you get to live something that you cannot really connect with any other way, just by living in the present day world that we live in today. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching the video, and yeah, please like and subscribe. Like my video, subscribe to the channel if you want to. And yeah, that'd be cool. And yeah, so thanks anyway, and I will see you guys in another video later. Check out the other videos.